What do Canadian Conservative voters actually think? Are we stuck in a mid-20th century set of ideas about fusionism, or is Canadian conservatism in the midst of figuring out what it means today? Check it out.
If you as a conservative were to be asked your issue positions on these two dimensions, on cultural issues and economic issues, 40 years ago, you would have said that you were economically liberal and socially traditionalist. And what's driving the change is the fact that those two are becoming increasingly mutually exclusive, that relationship is no longer there. If you're economically liberal, you are much more likely now to indicate that you're socially progressive.
Concepts with Shawn Whatley.
Welcome to Concepts. My name is Shawn Whatley, and today we spoke with Sam Routley. He's a PhD student at the University of Western Ontario. He writes a Substack, which I've enjoyed. It's called The Country of Our Defeat, and he explains where he gets the title from. It's not just a depressing title. And we focus our discussion, or we start out our discussion anyways, talking about a deep dive that he wrote for The Hub, and it was titled Decoding Canada's Conservative Coalition. And in it, he took a political science mindset to really dig into some of the voter percentages and mindsets and positions on social issues, economic issues. And his argument is that Canada actually is full of people on the conservative voting demographic anyways, who hold to the old-fashioned fusionist collaboration between free market libertarians and social traditionalists. He said, unlike the rest of the world, which seems to be moving away from that fusionism, and other conservative parties are starting to question the economic libertarian approach and starting to move more towards a more interventionalist approach when it comes to economics. He said Canada isn't. He said, according to the studies that he looked at, or the research that he looked at from 1997 to 2021, he said Canadian conservatives are still hanging on to economic free market thinking and a social traditionalism. So we had a long discussion about that. I didn't argue about his research findings, but I did ask him whether or not we were still wedded to what I've been calling economic determinism or economic reductionism. Are we able to say that politics is nothing but economics, and that really all of our social problems can be solved by economics? So we had a fascinating discussion. He was very, very careful not to take too rigid of a side on anything. In fact, he's very smooth, and he needs to protect his own student life and his job prospects after graduation. But I think we got him to open up the possibility that we've come to a position where we need more than just economic solutions, and conservatives need to get better at articulating a politics that says something about cultural and social issues and not just economics. Anyways, thank you so much for stopping by. Don't forget to click like and subscribe, and let's get on with the show. Sam Routley, welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shawn.
Yeah, my pleasure. And we both opened this podcast with huge smiles on our face because your cat walked right in front of the screen as we were starting recording. So hopefully we'll see the cat again. So I want to jump into a piece that you wrote for The Hub under their Deep Dive series. It's titled Decoding Canada's Conservative Coalition. And you really take a political scientist approach to that piece. But even before we get there, you published that piece, or a slightly longer piece, on your Substack, which I have been enjoying. And the title for your Substack, we'll put a link for it in the show notes as well, is called The Country of Our Defeat. And so I thought I just have to ask Sam, why did you pick that title?
Yeah, no, it's deliberately designed to be a little evocative and provocative, I think. It comes from an Alberti poem called The Country North of Belleville, and it's describing this area of central Ontario between Toronto and Ottawa. It describes the environment, the culture, the settlement, and Purdy uses this evocative language of the country of our defeat, being this is where civilization is at its limit. It's an area that sort of requires this constant work and effort that's continually defeated. And I thought it's a sort of useful and interesting and hopeful way of thinking about Canadian nationalism, I think, right? That we're in a time of sort of this strong national feeling, a sense of Canadian nationalism being something very hard, very fragile, but still something worth working towards. And I think that phrase, I think it seemed to me, kind of captures it in an interesting way.
Yeah, and it also is almost a flattery of our rugged individualism, whatever. We're living on the edge of the world, and you need to be tough to be here, and I don't know. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
I was worried that you were taking that title as just like, oh no, this guy's another conservative head shaker, oh, the world is going to hell, and whereas it's exactly not that. So that's really cool.
I think it does have that kind of dual meaning, but I think within the context of the poem, I think it's a hopeful one, because I think most of this conservative kind of coded conservative style way of talking about Canadian nationalism, your sort of George Grant style way, it's very romantic on the one hand, but it's also very defeatist, and I think I'm trying to take hold of that defeatism without necessarily letting it take us over, right? Giving us a chance of, this is a challenge, but it's still a challenge worth undertaking.
Yeah, so subversive. Oh, I like it. So it's interesting. One of my friends, he says, you can't be so negative. Don't be so negative. I said, no, I'm not being negative. If your patient is dying, you have to be honest about the current situation without being nihilistic. So to just be positive about the fact that your patient is very, very sick is not being, there's nothing good about that. Rose-colored glasses is not a good thing. Anyways, we better stop talking about nihilism and being subversive. I want to get to your article, which I thought was brilliant. And you can talk about nihilism if you want to, but Decoding Canada's Conservative Coalition. And I just wanted to get you to address a few opening remarks here that you make. So you make a comment about conservatism in the USA and Britain, and you say this, that they are, quote, no longer bound by the fusionist marriage of free market libertarians and social traditionalists, end quote. And then you go on to say that Canada is the exception. So just before we dive into the content of your study itself, just unpack for us this fusionism. We've talked about it before on the show, but I just want to hear you talk about it a bit.
Yeah, sure. And I think your listeners might know a good deal about this, but I think when we talk about conservatism as it exists in the Anglo-American context between your 1960s, your 1970s up until 2016, if not a little earlier, this is what we generally mean by fusionism, right? It emerges in 1960s, 1970s, a way to a sort of reaction to not only Keynesian economic policy, but also your sort of new social movements that kind of take place in the 1960s. It's a pushback against this large role for the government. It's this pushback against a lot of social changes that take place. It's this construction, right, putting together economic libertarians, social traditionalists into this electoral coalition, programmatic coalition on the basis of what Frank Meyer, right, the architect of fusionism, articulated as a shared version of a shared idea of freedom. He described it as grabbing the bull by both of its horns. And what's happened since 2016, not only with the election of Donald Trump, but Brexit too, I think is another clear sign of this, that it's come under a lot of stress, right, and tension within conservative politics itself, to the extent where in the US and in the UK, but I think especially in the US, it seems like conservatives as a whole have moved past it, not only in terms of this more ambiguous economic policy that they're taking, but this sort of greater engagement with cultural issues in a way that the sort of fusionist paradigm doesn't accommodate for, or at least actively deters against. And I think where my piece came from is it seems to me that Canada is something of an exception. that if you look at where the Conservative Party in Canada is right now, it's not all that different from where it was 20 years ago, right? There's still this support, this broad support for, you could call it a very libertarian economic agenda, basically about promoting economic freedom, individual freedom, reducing the size and scope and spending of government, alongside this sort of total avoidance, right, evasion of contentious cultural or social issues. Not only for the pragmatic side, but it's also justified by this idea that the state ultimately shouldn't rule on questions of social and cultural contestation. And so I'm interested in explaining not only how do we take account of these changes, the way conservatism is developing, but why is Canada has missed the bus, so to speak, on these changes.
Yeah, brilliant. And you say, building on what you just said, you say some conservatives in some other countries have, quote, softened their economics orthodoxy, end quote, and others have, quote, leaned into cultural debates, end quote, which is exactly what you were just saying here now. And then also, I like this part. You say that there's a risk there of, on the one hand, alienating the business community, and also, on the other hand, there's a risk of alienating the progressives and libertarians who are really right-leaning, if we can use that term, only really on economics. And so with that, then, let's jump into your study. And this is where you can be as nerdy as you want and share as many data points as you wish. If you start going on too far, I'll just lift up my hand and say, Professor Routley, hang on. But your study looks at 1997 to 2021 election study or survey data. So tell us what you found there.
Yeah, sure. My article draws upon the Canadian election study, which is this. It's a study administered by, it's an academic organization, moves universities every so often. The team changes, but it's administered during federal elections. There's a portion that's done before the election. There's a portion that's done after the election. And it basically asks people about a combination of their vote choice, their party identification, demographic variables, and some issue positions, right? It's a way to gauge where the public is, a way to assess people's voting decisions, why they make the decisions they do. And the way I used it is that when we talk about these changes that are happening with conservatism and the center right more generally, there's a lot of focus on the sort of ideological or programmatic changes, right? The idea that this is an activist or kind of leader-driven project where it's conservatives themselves disaffected with what came before. But there's also a really important electoral piece here that the article focuses on, which is to say that part of the accomplishment of fusionism, of these sort of early fusionist kind of entrepreneurs, we could say, right? Your Frank Myers, your Bill Buckleys, was to make economically liberal attitudes, so basically attitudes supporting greater economic freedom, consistent with social traditionalism, which is to say that if you as a conservative were to be asked your issue positions on these two dimensions, on cultural issues and economic issues, 40 years ago, you would have said that you were economically liberal and socially traditionalist. And what's driving the change is the fact that those two are becoming increasingly mutually exclusive, that relationship is no longer there. If you're economically liberal, you are much more likely now to indicate that you're socially progressive. And if you're socially conservative, you're much more likely to indicate that you're more economically interventionist, right? It seems like if we think about conservatism itself as a set of social stances, and this is borne out by some studies kind of done outside of the U.S. context, being socially traditionalist actually inherently pushes you towards these more protectionist economic policies, right? We have to understand that this connection that we associate with conservatism is a historical construction, right? It's not inherent. But what's interesting about the Canadian case that I found in the Canadian election study by comparing sort of the relationship that these issue positions have with each other is that unlike in the US, unlike in the UK, those attitudes are still perfectly consistent in Canada. Economic liberals, people who support greater economic freedom, less government intervention, sort of economic competition, are still very likely to be socially traditionalist. And the interesting thing of the article is not only that finding that exists, in which I think is quite counterintuitive, but to ask, what about Canada keeps that connection in place?
And so what about Canada keeps that connection in place?
Yeah, I mean, I think because what's interesting about conservative politics is there's sort of a distinction between, I think we can sometimes see conservatism too abstractly, that it's a set of principles, a sort of articulated agenda that the parties tend to follow pretty consistently. I think that's a mistake in some ways, because I think voters more generally, but also conservative voters, aren't necessarily always thinking about what's the best conservative way to approach this issue. As much as they're engaging in politics, they're making their electoral decisions within the context of their own immediate experiences, right? So there might be some loose conservative priors going on there contributing to those decisions, but someone cares about crime not because their conservative ideology tells them to care about crime, but because of the fact that they have to deal with crime, for example, right? Mm-hmm. Someone doesn't vote on the basis of economic prosperity because their conservatism tells them that that's what they ought to vote for. It's because that's what's most pressing. That's their most pressing need. And so on the basis of that, I suggest, it seems to me, it's an economic difference. But if we want to say that Fusionism has an economic project to it that's most associated with conservatism, this being essentially economic freedom, whether that's a lack of internal barriers, but also this integration into a global market. I think the fact that that's been enacted in the U.S. quite clearly and quite substantively, quite comprehensively, it seems to me that what's happening in the U.S. is it's this absence of government intervention. What's driving Trumpism, what's driving Brexit, a lot of these, call them populist movements, is basically there's still economic growth there. I think past conservative policy has accomplished this. It's just that it's not evenly felt. The sort of, I think this is most made clear by like something like the 2008 financial crisis. Essentially, it's about how do we not only grow the pie, but design these systems to better divide the pie between social constituencies, right? Especially these kind of middle American former manufacturing cores. And that sort of introduces this conversation about maybe we have to kind of rethink the role of the state in these economic processes. Whereas I think in Canada, it's a kind of a different story. It's almost the opposite, which is to say this conservative project of freedom, first of all, wasn't totally implemented. I think the Canadian public sector is still very large and still very kind of present in the roles of its citizens. And also, too, we have no real economic growth, right? It's not about dividing the fruits of our economic prosperity as much as it's accomplishing economic prosperity in the first place, right? So it seems to me that, again, in the U.S., it's this absence of the government, thinking about how do we reintegrate the government into our view. But it seems to me in Canada, because a lot of that past conservative policy, a lot of the articulated promises of that past conservative policy, the reasons why the ways it's been justified over the last 20, 30 years, still makes perfect sense in Canada. And it's still very much looking at how do we increase productivity, how do we solve those problems, how do we remain competitive given this sort of U.S. threat. It's basically unleashing the market through cutting regulations, reducing the public sector, so on and so forth. These very core conservative policies, and I think on the basis of that, the Conservative Party of Canada, alongside other parties, have been able to continue to find quite a lot of popular support on that very conventional agenda.
Yeah, brilliant. So I'm glad you went into all that. I liked what you were talking about in that people often, the way you put it in the article is you said when we're talking about being anti-big government or talking about being Tory touched and all these concepts, really they're too abstract for the average voter. And to your point, we tend to develop our political positions based on the needs that we feel in our own lives, whether they're economic or whatnot. And then I also thought it was brilliant how you juxtaposed the driving motivation south of the border, animating the Trump phenomenon, as being an issue about not enough government. So the Midwest being eviscerated because companies leave the country and offshore with really no concern to what happens to the communities that they've been a part of for maybe decades, maybe generations. And yet exactly the opposite thing is happening in Canada, where the driving motivation behind, at least what appears to be the driving motivation behind the conservative ethos, shall we say, is a response to too much government. You put it much more kindly. You said, I think you said we have a prominent public service that is evident in many aspects of life. So it's a very academic, polite way of saying it, which is accurate. I'll dumb it down and just say, in Canada, we have too many people telling us what to do from the government. Now that I've totally paraphrased you and maybe paraphrased you in a wrong way, I'm wondering, this is something I've been struggling with recently. So I agree with you highlighting economics, and especially, you mentioned Keynesianism, and again, our listeners will know that John Maynard Keynes, right? Was that his name? John Maynard Keynes. Yeah, he was most famous for saying that there's an opportunity. I believe his exact phrase was an opportunity to correct errors in aggregate demand. Is that his correct wording? I think that's his wording. Basically, failures in aggregate demand is a fancy way to say that the market fails every now and then when everybody just simply chases what they want. And so we need a big, powerful, very smart and expert government or people within the government to smooth that for us so that we don't experience the full impact of those failures of aggregate demand. And I think from the economic point of view, a lot of, at least as far as I can tell, a lot of economists would still say, yeah, there's truth there, right? We saw even Prime Minister Stephen Harper bailed out the auto sector. And so that was, we could say, a failure of aggregate demand that was assuaged by or alleviated by the intervention of government, big government. But on the whole, this is a bright dividing line between conservatives and liberals, where conservatives, at least since the Reagan era, would say, wait a second, no, we're going to cause more problems than we fix if we have government intervening in the economy all the time. And once I ask my question, you can tell me whether I've set this up wrong or not. You can say, oh, I disagree with your priors. That's totally okay. So those are my priors. My priors are, there's a sense on the right that messing around in the economy is bad. And people will make their own minds up better than we can as really smart civil servants. However, I think that was very relevant at the end of the 1970s, right? The rise of Reagan and Thatcher and even Mulroney in Canada. It was really the animating spirit of Reaganism, shall we say. Neoconservatism, we can throw a lot of labels in there. And I think the truth or the wisdom of that approach still applies when you look at those economic issues, the interventionism of government. However, conservatism has always been about prudence, about trying to develop policies based on the most pressing issues of the day. And so not to take an ideological approach where cutting taxes, decreasing spending, and shrinking government is always the answer to everything. As long as we have good economics, all of our social issues will go away. We won't have troubles with safe supply policies. We won't have trouble with massive immigration. We won't have trouble with a tanking fertility rate as long as we get our economics correct. Mm-hmm. And so I sense that people are still trying to hang on to this, what I'm calling is economic determinism, or economic reductionism, where everything about politics is just about the economy. And that's all we need to focus on. So I'm wondering, in your reading and in your studies, you've identified that it seems like voters are still thinking this way. And we could debate whether or not people are asking the right questions and whether the data you found is actually true. But even beyond that, let's think about today and tomorrow. Can we still say that economics will save us?
Yeah, no, that's a big question. I'll answer it this way. I think when we're talking about these political changes that we're seeing, not only as it pertains to center-right conservative parties, but the sort of electoral programmatic stances that their competitors are taking. It seems to me that there's a role for culture here and there's a role for economic change. I just don't know which is more preeminent and which one is more paramount. I think they both matter. I mean, because on the one hand, I think we can emphasize it from an economic lens to say it's basically, if you want to say that governments implemented these, you can call them neoliberal or monetarist policies, that's led to, through globalization, through the development of the knowledge economy, led to this relayering, this restructuring of economic interests. And the fact that you have this sort of emerging and clear divide between your sort of professional knowledge economy, highly educated professionals, and on the one hand, you're more kind of blue collar, put their hands kind of types. That's the sort of novel, emergent economic change. And that's one way to look at it. The other way is to kind of focus on what's been referred to as post-materialist values. So basically to say, and this kind of comes from the 1970s or so, which is to say basically that because we've attained this position of sort of general material prosperity, the sort of distributive conflicts that used to structure politics have been not solved, but at least have been made secondary. And so people are now incorporating these cultural considerations related to, on the left, this idea of self-actualization, right? Versus on the right, this insistence on tradition, order, community, so on and so forth. I think both matter, but the post-materialist kind of argument leans on the fact that economic conditions don't matter, right? But it seems like, given that we've entered an era in which, whether we're talking about the US or Canada, the fact that people are actually facing these very stark cost of living challenges. I mean, we could call crime, insofar as it affects safety, to be a very core issue, right? That sort of diminishes the impact of culture. Another way of thinking about this, and I'm avoiding giving you a clear answer, but they overlap, because these economic differences, right? These people with university degrees who work in the knowledge economy in Toronto or New York tend to be very socially progressive, whereas your people who we would characterize as the working class have a very different set of economic interests, have a very different sort of economic position, tend to be predominantly socially conservative. And so it seems to me, again, to reiterate here, hopefully this is satisfying enough for you, right? I think it's a bit of both, and I think you are right in saying that the main criticism that past conservative politics has gotten is its absence of culture, right? And it seems like perhaps there are a number of culturally kind of tinged, culturally adjacent policies that sort of need a rearticulated approach. But whether or not those can be addressed through economic fixes, they can be framed as economic issues. Immigration is an example of an issue that kind of, it touches an economic dimension, but it also touches a cultural one. And I think the contestation, right, the push is over these emergent issues like immigration is the right and proper and prudent thing to do, whether we're talking electorally, whether we're talking about ideologically, to focus on the economic dimensions or the cultural dimensions. Mm-hmm. And I think the gist is that there's these economic forces swirling around, there's these cultural forces swirling around, which makes a very sort of complicated brew, right? And I think parties are working through both of these in real time.
Yeah. And I should say, you don't have to worry at all, Professor Routley. You're going to be Professor Routley or something, Consultant Routley. You don't have to worry at all about us compromising your future employment prospects, either as a consultant for the Conservative Party or in government or in academia. You're giving beautiful answers. And even in your comments, it seems to me that you pulled out both sides of the spectrum, which is brilliant as well. You said, quote, economic conditions don't matter, end quote, as one end of the spectrum. And then I would say the other end of the spectrum would be to say that it's nothing but economic incentives. And both the left and right will say that we can reduce everything to incentives.
Yeah.
The reason I get so animated about this is for several reasons. Number one, I'm not sure that a hyper focus on economics actually works. First, because it doesn't seem to be efficacious historically. And second, it doesn't seem like the Conservatives have the desire or the power to make the changes that are required to allow the free markets that they want. They simply just cut taxes or decrease a little bit of regulation here or there, but the regulatory ratchet just keeps turning the one direction, right? You read the literature on regulation, and the regulatory ratchet is this idea that every regulation just adds to another one, and it's very hard to turn it backwards. Basically, it doesn't go backwards. It just goes forwards and forwards. And I haven't seen a Conservative Party yet that's able to effectively reduce from, if we use a level of 100 as the current regulatory burden, down to 30, or at most they get down to 96 or 95%, but they don't make a very big difference. So that's one issue. The second concern I have is that I don't see that the economic argument goes far enough in actually solving some of the issues that we're facing. You could say that we've never been more rich than we've ever been as a Western society, and yet our fertility rate is plummeting. And to say, well, it's just because people don't have enough money. No, it's more than that. I think it's about whether or not we say, this is a good thing for you to do. Go out, have kids. Kids are great. Well, let's welcome kids. And then, again, my economist friends would say, well, it's just because we don't have free daycare or something. It doesn't seem to fit with the problems. But my final reason for doubting this economic determinism, and never mind the fact that Marx said everything about society was, the substructure of society was based on material interests, and everything else, culture, all the rest was just the superstructure. And really, we didn't really have to think about it, just focus on economics. So we'll leave that to the side. I throw that in as a bonus point. The thing that really animates me is my work in leadership, in administration. So I've spent several decades working in hospital leadership and working around docs and nurses and in medical politics, and throwing out an incentive, an economic incentive, or a rule, either adding a rule or removing a rule, never creates the amount of change that you want. I love policy. I've written tons of policy, and I cringe at some of the policies I wrote. I just say, oh gosh, how did I write that? Because I've become convinced that what really drives behavior is the culture of a particular environment. And culture doesn't have to be spooky. If you have a culture of starting meetings late in your organization, that's your culture. It's just a collection of the norms and behaviors. You have a lateness culture. You might say it's laid back, it's friendly, it's welcoming. So all of these surrogate markers, for example, the time at which you start a meeting, are indicators of a broader cultural set of assumptions. And so that's the level I think we need to be talking about culture at. How can we promote a vision of Canada that welcomes builders, innovators, creators? In the healthcare space, if you come up with an innovation, you know you can't sell it in Canada. you're going to sell it somewhere else. Now, my economist friends will say, see, Shawn, you just came up with an economic reason. And so you're right, they are tied. But is there a way, or have you seen in your political science studies, a way to talk about culture that doesn't give people an allergic reaction? Because I think culture is the basis of the fire, the desire, the willingness to take risks, the swashbuckling attitude. How do we amplify that? Because that's what I think Canada needs right now.
Yeah, I think you're right in saying you can frame a lot of this as this shift to culture with a question mark on it. I think it goes back to like conservatism itself as a sort of deeper tradition has always been more. You could arguably define it as such, right? That it's been far more concerned with culture meaning this kind of lived experience, right? The set of values of sort of higher calling, right? Civic virtue that sort of other contemporary ideologies don't share, right? If you think of Marxism/socialism and liberalism, right? They justify themselves. They think about politics through a very deductive, rationalistic perspective, right? They seek to conform the world to a set of established principles and construct their views of the world, their political kind of programs on the basis of a sort of objective set of interests. I think some socialists and liberals will take problem with that view, but if we're looking at it as an ideal type, I think. Whereas conservatism has always challenged them by saying that people don't behave as rational individuals, right? They don't follow incentives perfectly as much as people are the product of their cultures, right? And culture not in an economic way, not in the sense of material accumulation, but a question of value. And I think the fusionist response that we're still living under was not to deny that culture doesn't matter, as much as it was interested in taking culture out of the purview of the state, right? Thinking about your sort of Austrian school influence, your Hayeks and such, right? That the argument was that individuals are the best guardians of their own culture, and any effort of the state or any large top-down organization to impose, right, implement, coerce culture, not only doesn't work, right, but is inherently coercive, leads down this downward cycle, right, towards a bad situation. That was the concern. And this was shaped not only by the Cold War in the 60s, but also you could argue that wokeism, what we call that set of movements that we call it, it's an example of organizations trying to impose a set of values from a top-down process. So the response there was to say that the reason why we only focus on economics is because economics allow for those baseline conditions that enable individual grassroots construction of culture. But the more recent trend you see today, right, is one of two things. The first one being that there are these negative cultural developments, right? Both to say that we could talk about atomization, rising loneliness, lack of birth rates, that's a clear cultural problem that requires cultural solutions. But a more kind of substantive critique is to say that you can't be neutral on matters of culture, right? So the fusionist aim, its objective is to say we can separate economics, sort of material conditions from culture, from questions of ultimate value. And this is very much the critique of your post-liberals, right? Is to say that any state, any organization is always necessarily imposing, advocating for this vision of social good. And so what's changing, I think, is not only that question of culture, but more importantly, and I think this is why culture is really difficult, is that you necessarily have to articulate for it to be substantive, for it to mean anything. You have to articulate a very substantive and very contentious sort of concept of ultimate value, right? You can't appeal to individual freedom here, right? You can't say, I'm free to do my one thing and you're free to do the other thing. You have to appeal to something that goes beyond individuals, something that exists on a social level, on a cultural level, on an ontological level, you could say, to be pretentious here. And to do that, you need a sense of consensus, you need a sense of shared national purpose, a sense of sort of civic identity, right? And thinking about how do we justify cultural initiatives through a inherently contentious cultural articulation, but how do you essentially reshape the culture except through a top-down way, I think is the challenge. And I think that's the kind of conversation that we're having, right? And I think there's some conservative voices that are arguing that you have to we should impose it. Some schools are arguing this, whereas you still have the fusionists, right? That are still insisting on the fact that the state ought not to interfere in that area. And I think most people find themselves somewhere in the middle there.
Yeah. No, I think you've nailed it. The crux is that it seems the only way we can respond to some of the cultural issues we're facing is to have an element of the state involved. And this is what makes me panic. There are really only two options to choose. The post-war liberal path that we've been on is done. We've drawn down as much of the good ideas that are in that pathway. And now what panics me, what makes me really worried, is that people will say, well, we just need a really strong man to come and exert his will and straighten us out. That worries me. So the Nietzschean path, the Übermensch. And so I think the only alternative, as far as I can tell, is an intellectual conservatism. And the trouble with intellectual conservatism, even in your article, you said the average voter, whatever, Tory touch, what the heck does that mean? And I'm not saying intellectual conservatism is about being Tory touched, but I think we need to figure out how to rescue Canada. Maybe we've already lost Canada, but we need to figure out how to rescue Canada by articulating an intellectual conservatism that wrestles with a substantive or a content-full view of society that avoids dictating specifics about you must wear lace-up shoes to the office and you must wear a three-piece suit with the cufflinks and all the rest. And so that's where the opportunity, not just the opportunity lies, but the need, I think, lies right now. Because even if we talk about freedom, yes, we all love freedom, but to say freedom is a good, defined by what? So if we agree that freedom is a virtue, well, now you're appealing to something outside of ourselves that defines it as a good. And so if you remove that and say, no, freedom is just whatever you do, well, then now you've taken away any reason for even making those choices. So you're stuck having these discussions. And I think we're living in Plato's cave, or maybe Strauss's cave beneath Plato's cave, if we think we can't have these discussions. So a case in point, just to make it practical, people have been talking about Premier Doug Ford's spending on DEI investment. And you don't have to respond because we want to protect your job prospects in the future or conservative, wherever you want to get a job. But if you feel comfortable talking about it, we could talk about it. But Doug Ford has apparently spent or invested $500 million, I think is the number, or $500 million on DEI education. And as though we don't know enough about it already. But so we really got to make sure people understand DEI. Well, that is a cultural standpoint. That is shaping the culture in a particular direction. That is saying that your skin color matters more than how hard you work. Your ethnic background or your cultural background matters more than what you can actually produce on a blinded studies. So I don't need to talk just about DEI, but I just raise that as an example of the state enforcing its idea, the so-called Conservative Party. And so in your studies, in your travels, do you see an opportunity for a way to advocate for common sense? Is there an opportunity for conservatives to come out and articulate something? The other thought that jumped to mind when you were talking about rationalism, and we think of Oakeshott's Rationalism in Politics and other essays, and he's an atheist, so he's certainly not pushing his Christianity on anybody, but he said we have to be careful about this ideological, crisp policy, would you say, rationalism, objectivism, that's right. So that this kind of rigid objectivist approach to policymaking, we need to be careful of that. So that's more a feature of the left. And he also spent a lot of words, great big fat book and many other books, describing an approach to politics that still advocated a flavor, a culture, a sense of doing politics, shall we say, that went far beyond simply economic policies. So now I've given you my bias. I think that's where we need to go. But I need you now to tell me why this is a good idea and how many other smart people would agree with me.
Yeah, I think there's a practical side to this, and then there's the I don't want to say more ideologically, but more hopeful idea, or at least are we looking to win elections, or are we looking to actually enact change? Right, I think is one way to put it. I think talking about this distinction between economics and culture, I think, and this is the argument I made in the article, I think conservatives can still continue to win elections on the basis of economics alone, right? I think Canada's economic position means that there's a common economic interest, there's a common incentive, right? And as long as you promise people or show them a means, whether it's through conservative solutions or not, to secure a position of better prosperity, whether it's having more money or being able to afford a house or less crime, I think the party can continue to do that, at least federally. This question of what comes after, once you've figured that stuff out, how do you actually enact all these further changes, I think is something a bit more open to question. And I think when it comes to articulating, like you mentioned, sort of deeper foundational intellectual conservatism, the kind that can speak on issues that are not just issues other than economics, I think it's a problem of foundations. By this I mean that you can distinguish conservatism into a kind of epistemological type and an ontological type. By that I'm saying that what we associate with conservatism, what most people kind of articulate when they're describing the ideology or the political philosophy, is to say it's basically this aversion to change, or it's this aversion to a sort of a rational, objective way of policy making, right? The oak and shoot style of conservatism is to basically challenge our capacity, is to say we have limited knowledge, we have a limited sense of how things work, and so it's best to kind of appeal to tradition, do the way things have always been in a way, or at least maintain the sense of continuity, right? It's not a perfect way to describe it, but that's the idea. I think what conservatism has a problem articulating is the ontological side of things. So the nature of the way things are, why we ought to value certain things, why the status quo is preferable, why certain outcomes that would happen from not being prudent are bad, and then to do that, it seems to me, you need to appeal to foundations below conservatism, right? So we could argue conservatism is this it's a prudential approach. It's a way of approaching the sort of actual act of policymaking in the specifics. But if we're talking about why freedom is a value, why family formation is valuable, why DEI is a bad thing, it seems to me you can't articulate something substantive and something powerful without appealing to a further sense of value. And there's different ways to do that, right? You could appeal ultimately to liberalism. A lot of conservatives, I think Oakenshoot and Scruton would consider themselves to be conservative liberals. I think if you read Scruton in particular, I think it's ultimately based off of this more kind of pragmatic liberalism, a liberalism with qualifications. You could also appeal to Christianity or religious foundation, or there's these alternative appeals, basically to stuff concrete and historic and foundational, right? Not principles in the same way that these other ideologies do. But how to do that in a moment of cultural and a lack of cultural consensus where people are coming into things with a different set of values, how you engage in moral language is the challenge. And I think, and it's ultimately, it's more than just political, right? If you want to say politics is downstream from culture, culture which is downstream from religion, right? Which is, to quote Newhouse, right? Is I think it's much more than just politics, right? It's much more than just policy making. It's much more than elections. It's a cultural conversation that ought to be had at the grassroots and through these other institutions, right? And so I think if conservatives are taking transformation really seriously, they have to think about what foundation are we going to appeal to, and how do we utilize these other social, economic, political institutions to enact that change, right? It's a very large, it's a very ambitious project, I think, and I think no one quite has a clear sense of how to do it.
No. Well, very well said, by the way. And it made me think of a post I saw on Twitter on X, or an Australian MP saying, vote for us, we are going to tweak your taxes a little bit and decrease regulation. I thought, oh my gosh, you're missing the point. So to your point, so you said we want to, forget what word you said. I just used the word nerdy. I think you said presumptuous or something, maybe pedantic when you said ontological. So ontology is a branch of philosophy that talks about being. What does it mean to be something? If you are a cat and now you are a dog, your ontology has changed from being a cat to being a dog. So it's not spooky either. But to your point, I think that's exactly what people are talking about today. So John Gray, someone I like, it's hard to pin him down. Is he a conservative? Is he a liberal? Anyways, he wrote a piece just recently in the New Statesman, which is identified as a progressive outlet in the UK. But he talks, I forget the exact title of it. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But he's talking about how he thinks we need a Hobbesian liberalism. That's the only solution. And so Hobbes, the author of the Leviathan, and because the natural state of humans is nasty, poor, brutish, and short, we'd basically just kill each other, which I don't agree with. Like if I met you on a deserted island, I'd probably ask you, do you have a canoe or a boat? I wouldn't say, oh, I better kill Sam. But anyways, that's a Hobbesian prior, or his given. And maybe it's as a result of the civil wars that he was witnessing and so on. But so Hobbes said the only way to avoid all this is to have a big, powerful state. And John Gray is saying, well, that's where we're at because we have so many divisions. But the reason I mentioned Gray, not only so that people will go check out his article, which I thought was fascinating, but to call again to his work from the 1990s. He published a brilliant collection of essays called Enlightenment's Wake. And he argued that we've come really to the end of the Enlightenment approach. Lots of good things about the Enlightenment. However, the methodological presuppositions of the Enlightenment, at least politically, is to not ask these big questions, right? Machiavelli famously said, how do we get things done in politics? Stop asking about formal causes and final causes and what does it mean to be human and what does it mean to live a good life? Don't ask those questions. I think all those questions have come back in spades because we have people blocking our streets, making arguments about what is good and what isn't good. And so I hope you're wrong when you say conservatives can still win on economics. I suspect you're right. Because my worry is if we keep thinking we can win on economics, we won't grapple with these bigger questions. And these are the questions I think that young people are asking? I'll let you respond, and then I'll ask you my last question.
Sure. Yeah. No, a lot there. Yeah, I think we could rephrase it as liberalism being kind of an outgrowth of the Enlightenment. I think you can characterize fusionism as a conservative form of liberalism. I think it's at its root a version of liberalism, right? It appeals to individual freedom as its ultimate value, and I think it appeals to this idea of the social contract, right? It comes from Hobbes and Locke, right? Which is to say basically that we can decide these questions through consensus, through deliberation, whether that's in a actual physical historical social contract as a Lockean or Hobbesian would envision, but I think Rawls provides the sort of philosophical way to think about is our politics designed in a way that would have come out of a social contract, right? And so I think part of the divide within conservative politics is and in politics generally, right? We could say is the people who still support that liberal tradition, still think it's valuable, versus the people who argue that we actually need to revert back to these more kind of primal and objective sources of good, right? Good that's good not because we all came together and agreed it's good, but because it's actually good, right? However you want to accept, right? Like you can make you do an Aristotelian natural law kind of approach, but yeah. My point is to say that it doesn't necessarily lead to these kind of transformative. That there's alternatives, and I think we're working through them.
Yeah. And just again, beautifully said, by the way. And I think Rawls has been shown to be, all these people who come up with these original the original condition, right? It's like the old joke. Mm-hmm. And I think I could tell the joke now. I might ruin it again. But if you're three people were found a can of beans on a deserted island, and one of them was an engineer, and one was a physicist, and one was an economist. You've heard this joke, right? And they need to figure out how to open their can of beans without wasting any of the beans. And so the engineer comes up with a fascinating engineering drawing about rocks and levers and all these things, and how you're going to get the can of beans open so they won't waste a drop of beans and their lives will be saved. The physicist said, no, that's nonsense. You don't know anything about the nature, the physical nature of beans. And so he comes up with a better plan he thinks is a better plan to open the can of beans. And so the economist said, no, you guys are both wrong. Listen, first, we assume a can opener. So the joke being, right, we assume a perfectly rational, unfettered market.
Yeah.
So we inevitably get back to the scariness of a government imposing something. I think we can't avoid government imposing something, but it doesn't have to be scary. We've got 800 years of a messy, mixed up British history behind us where they really kind of had minimum specifications and said, okay, we have this thing called the Crown, and we have Magna Carta, and we have habeas corpus, and we have all of these very loose, but also very real pillars that hold our society together. And within that very, shall we say, a broad set of guardrails, it turns out a whole bunch of freedom can emerge, including freedom of religion, freedom of association, all sorts of freedoms. Wonderful freedoms can grow. However, they grow when the guardrails have been defined. And that's really an old-fashioned conservatism. It's very minimalist. I maybe that's a good title for it, minimalist conservatism. We need a minimalist sense, but this complete aversion to telling anybody any expectations about anything is a hyper-individualistic, and Francis Fukuyama even says hyper-individualism, and he's the modern prophet for liberalism. He said this hyper-individualism is what's causing problems. And it doesn't work in parenting. You've got a new baby in your house. Just letting your kid do whatever they want, whenever, just go and be free. It doesn't work. You actually have to tell them, well, no, I want you to learn what's required in sitting at the table with other people who are eating a meal. Like, there's a whole set of requirements there. And so we need to figure out a way to articulate culture, expectations, social expectations that aren't spooky. We're not saying you need to go to mass 3 times a week, but that's what people immediately think. Oh, we're trying to now impose establishmentarianism. And I'm saying, no, there's a spot intermediary somewhere between a very rigid top-down definition of all the particulars of life versus a complete laissez-faire. We're not going to say anything because that approach is not working in my mind. I better stop there and let you respond, and then I'll ask you my last question.
No, I agree with you, right? I think because liberals start with the individual, right? And that the world kind of starts as individuals and we form communities off the basis of self-interest, right?
Right.
Hobbes in particular saying it's so we don't kill each other, right?
Yeah.
We don't have any other option. But that's not true, right? I think the community pre-exists the individual, right? We don't come into the world as autonomous, rational individuals, but we're the product of the culture that raises us, right? And I think, and so I think you're right. I think the task is about not only determining what those guardrails are, but what's the kind of moral and ontological language, right? This process that we use to articulate it and justify it, to suggest that this is something that ought to be enforced by the community, in a way, right? That can lead to consensus, right? It's not this imposition of one particular moral framework, fighting with others, but to say, what do we take from our common experience, from our common heritage, from our common experiences to have that conversation? And it's a fundamentally rationalist process, right? It's to say, what are the principles? How do we realize them in practice? And I think, and the question is, do we want to continue to use liberalism as that framework? There's obviously there's flaws with it, but I think it can still be workable. Or do we want to move towards these alternatives, right? That sort of pre-existed liberalism, and I think that the kind that conservatism, sort of these non-liberal forms of it, kind of offer, I think is something to work through, I think it's a open-ended task.
Yeah, no, another brilliant response, Professor Routley. You're protecting your future. No, I shouldn't keep teasing you. So just on that comment about liberalism, like I said, liberalism is wonderful if everybody already knows the rules of the game, right? If everybody agrees on what hockey is, you can have a very minimalist approach. You don't even need referees because once you get on the ice, okay, hey, don't do that. That's not hockey. That's lacrosse. You don't whack people with a stick. And what I'm suggesting is that we've lost that set of shared assumptions. And unless we can articulate a very minimalist set of assumptions that will maximize our freedom and maximize the opportunity to be who you are and explore your PhD in political science without restrictions, then we're in trouble. Anyways, I'm talking too much. My last question, ask everybody this, and I have to be careful how to phrase it. What have I not asked you that I should be asking you? What are you worrying about? And I won't ask you what's keeping you awake at night. That's usually how I phrase it. But you with a young child in the house, you'll just say, oh, my kid's keeping me awake. So what should we be asking ourselves right now?
That's a really good question. I think because we covered quite a lot here, and I'm thinking about which direction to go in, right? Because we talked about the electoral side of things, and we talked about the deeper foundational ideological side of things. I think what I'll say generally, and this isn't because I'm being honest here, this doesn't have much to do with the piece though. I think we talk about the need for better guardrails, moral and ontological foundations. I think that's not only, I think this is my point here, is that's not only an abstract philosophical exercise. I think we not only have very pressing challenges, but I think we're on the cusp of a lot of social changes. And I think that unless we learn how to better articulate that, especially when it comes to the nature of what it means to be a human being, the nature of what a good human life is, these kind of questions, fundamental questions, affect politics, but are ultimately beyond politics. I think we're if we don't do that, I think we'll go down pretty dark paths. That's at least my fear. That's what keeps me awake at night.
Great.
Other than infants.
Yes, other than infants. Sam, that was a great response. I should have given you a warning. I apologize, but you came up with a beautiful answer. Thank you for taking the time here, and I really look forward to what you write next.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Excellent.